In this lesson, we're going to see how to use Web SQL. This is an HTML5 feature which allows you to store relational databases on your browser machine, rather than having to store data back up and forth to the server every time. Now, Web SQL is laid on top of local storage, and every origin has its own set of related databases. So, for example, as a user, if you visit mydomain1.com and mydomain2.com, each of those domains has its own set of databases that you can access client-side in your application. Now, in this example, I have a simple database. It has a single table called courses, and I can add, delete, and view the items in that table. So first of all, I'll enter a name for a new course, such as French. Let's say a French course might last 5 days. I click the Add Course button, and it tells me one row has been inserted, and it also tells me the ID of that new row. I can view that course, like so. It gives me the ID, the name, and the duration. I can add another course here. Let's say you wanted to learn Welsh. Welsh is quite a hard language, so let's say that would take 10 days. I click Add. So that one has an ID of 2. And if I click Select Courses, we now have 2 courses in our portfolio. Imagine that learning Welsh is actually something that you don't want to do. I'll delete that course. And then if I click Select Courses again, we're back to the 1. So that's a fairly simple example. Let's have a look at the code that underpins it. So the code is in the file called websql.html. You have to run this through a web server. On my machine, I've set up IIS from Microsoft, the Microsoft web server, and I'm running this example through that web server. So the code file on your machine is like this. I'll go to the bottom of the page first of all, just to show you what the markup looks like. We have a text box where you can enter a description for the course, so French or Welsh. And we have another text box where you can specify the duration, 5 days or 10 days. And then 3 buttons where we can add, delete, and select the courses. And then a message area, that's the area that's displayed in blue on the web page. That's the message area there. We also have another area where we display the list of courses. Right, when the page is loaded, this is the code that gets executed. So I set up some global variables just to identify the various text boxes and divs that we've just seen. There's a property called Open Database. Now, if that property exists on your window object, then your browser does support WebSQL. Obviously, if that property doesn't exist, then your browser doesn't support WebSQL. So let's assume that our browser does support WebSQL. We display a message there that indicates that is the case. And then we open the database. Now, the Open Database function returns a database handle. I store that in a global variable called db. And we'll use that later on, obviously. The Open Database function takes 4 parameters. The first parameter is the name of the database. So you can call that anything you want. And then the version number. You can only have 1 copy of the database at the same time. It's not as if you can have 3 or 4 different versions sitting side by side. That's just there for schema management, really. And then we have a description of the database. Again, so that's free format text. And then here is an estimate of how big you think the database is going to be. This is going to be a fairly small database in this example. So I've created the database. And then in the database, I create a table first time round in a transaction. This is a common pattern. You take your database object and you call the transaction function. The transaction function can take a function like so. This is the callback function, if you like, for the transaction to say, this is what I want to do inside the transaction. So the callback function receives the transaction parameter, and then the transaction parameter, you can execute SQL inside that transaction. So as you can see here, I'm going to create a new table, and the table is going to be called courses, and it'll have 3 columns. It'll have an ID, which is the primary key, 1, 2, 3, for example, the name of the course, such as French or Welsh, and then the duration, which is an integer. So the execute SQL function takes the string that you want to execute, and then an array of parameters that you might want to pass in to the SQL statement, if you have any placeholders, for example. Now, I don't have any placeholders here, so I've just specified an empty array. So this will create the table courses if it doesn't already exist. And then we call a select courses function. I'll have a look at that later in this demo, which displays the courses first time through. Let me take you to the top of the code to look at the script to insert and delete the courses. So the script starts on line 23, but we're going to look at line 33 through to 49 first of all. This is the function that gets called when you click the add course function. So basically inside a transaction, I provide two callbacks this time. A callback to actually perform the work for the transaction, and that's this first function here. And then a second callback that displays any errors. So the first callback function will get the name of the course that you've entered, such as French, and the duration, so that's 5 days. And then it'll execute an SQL statement, and the SQL statement will insert into the courses table, specifying the name and the duration, these values. This is very familiar SQL syntax. So these are placeholders, and you provide the placeholders in the second parameter here. Okay, so this is the second parameter to the execute SQL function. The first parameter is the SQL itself, and then the second parameter is an arbitrary array specifying the values. So this value will fill in the first placeholder, and this value will specify the second placeholder. The final parameter to the execute SQL is a callback function that will be executed after the SQL is finished. This callback function I'll show you in a moment. First of all though, there's a possibility that things might have gone wrong. So inside here, this is the error callback for the transaction, and it displays any error message on the screen. Now, if this error callback has occurred, the transaction will automatically be rolled back. So for example, here in my code which inserts a new item, if I threw an exception, like so, then that would cause the callback function here to fail, and the failure would be handled by this exception handler effectively, and that would automatically roll back the transaction. Now, I don't really want to do that, so let me just remove those two statements there. So we have inserted a new row into the courses table, and then assuming everything's gone well, this function will be called afterwards. So that's the function we have down here. And this function receives a transaction object. This is the transaction that's currently running, and a result set object. And what's of interest to us here is that the result set object has a rows affected property. That'll tell me how many rows have been affected by the insert. It also has an insert ID property to tell me the ID of the new item that's been inserted. And often you need this. When you insert a new item, you want to get the ID of the new item so that you can display it to the user, potentially. So let's have a look at the code which deletes an item from the table. Same sort of idea really. We'll start off on line 57 and we'll go through to line 77. We start a transaction, and that's the transaction function there. We give it two functions. First function is the callback which will execute the code. So we get the name of the course that the user's entered, such as Welsh. And then this time we execute an SQL statement to delete from the courses table items based on that name. So the name here will be the name of the course, such as Welsh, and it'll display the results of that delete statement here. And that's the function we have here, and that will tell me how many rows have been deleted by the delete statement. Right, the last thing to look at is how we actually select all the items. So let me show you that here. That's on line 80. This is the function that gets called when I click the select courses button here. So it starts a transaction, and inside the transaction, it just specifies a single function. There's no error callback here because really there's not much that can go wrong, to be honest. So here we execute an SQL statement to select all the rows from the courses table. There are no placeholders in the select statement, so I pass in an empty square brackets there. This is the callback function which will retrieve the result set from the select statement, and that's this function here. So this function receives the current transaction and the result set that contains the result of the select. It has a rows property, which is effectively the results of the select statement. That will tell me how many rows were selected in the SQL select statement. and then I iterate through those rows, and each row represents one of the rows in the database. And this is how you can access the data for the current row. So for the current row, that will give me the ID column. And then for the current row, this will give me the name column. And for the current row, this will give me the duration column. And remember, this is what it looks like when you display the information on the screen. So that's the end of the lesson. We've seen how you can open a database using the open database function, which was here. We've seen how using the database object, you can start transactions. And within the transaction, you can execute SQL statements and look at the results that it gives you back.